Hi, Pastor Adam here. We are continuing our discussion on social media this week, talking about how we perceive social media. Is social media really just a platform for self? Whose narrative are we really promoting? What example do we have in Scripture when it comes to that? What does Christ exemplify? We live in a world that perpetuates the exaltation of self. So, how are we using social media? If those things sound interesting to you, then this might be the sermon for you. We're focusing, obviously, this month on social media and how we can be discerning of how it is that social media, as I said in the prayer just now, influences our lives as believers, influences our identity. Where do we take our cues from? How do we shape who we are going to be as we, go out into the world? The Scripture calls us to be transformed and renewed in our minds, but when it comes to how we interact within the digital world, are we honoring that completely? Are we doing that in those spaces as well? And are we discerning of the influence that social media has on our lives? Are we using our speech in a wise way? Are we using our time, our countless hours in a wise way? That's something that's beneficial and useful and productive for either ourselves or for the people around us. Are we honoring relationships? As we talked about last week, relationships. Are we honoring relationships with intent and purpose on social media? Are we letting the ball drop there as well? Do you have friends, or do you just have fans on social media? Are you a friend, truly? Do you have a philosophy of what that even means? Or are you just creeping on who you follow on any given platform? Do you maintain a philosophy for meaningful relationships on social media, a biblical philosophy for meaningful relationships there? And these are the things that we've been talking about over the past couple weeks, the things we've been discussing and pondering as our days and week go by, the things that we're going back to. We're not just taking it here, discussing it in cell groups, and then that's it. Are we applying it to our lives? Are we pondering it daily? How am I going to be a disciple of Christ on social media as well? We have to acknowledge that for a good amount of people, the reality is that we spend a lot of time on social media. And so we can't afford to just be part-timers in terms of how we apply our faith. We need to apply it to these strange new digital worlds as well. So are you living faithfully in these spaces of social media? Many of your fans, your friends, are looking into your life because you've allowed them the window to do that. So what are you giving them in return? What are you presenting to them? Are you showing them, a part-time Christian identity, or are you being holistic in your approach there? So we're called to more, to show and offer more to a world looking to form meaningful identity. So this week we're going to continue the discussion, continue the conversation, and I want us to discern what social media encourages when it comes to its philosophy of me. Not Adam, but me, you. Its philosophy of self. I want us to consider how social media has really just become a self-media. For many people who invest in these platforms, in social media, actually socializing has become, at best, secondary, a byproduct. For many, it's all about building the brand, and not just the brand, but my brand. How can I use social media to build my brand? That's the culture that we are in today, and that's how social media, as I see it, is used today. It's not about being social. It's not about connecting with people necessarily. It's about perpetuating self. It's the whole platforms have features and are enabling us to do this very thing, to perpetuate self above anything else, building my brand. That should go without saying that that's pretty contrary to who we're called to be. It presents a massive problem for us as believers. When God is to be the focus and target of honor and glory, how can we possibly hope to accomplish that when we live in a world where social media is the vehicle where we can truly build my brand rather than God's brand? The culture emphasizes this self-centered way of life with social media being the tool we can use to work on it. The emphasis is self above everything, prioritization of self above everything, the preservation of me above anything. It offers us constant, instant, free gratification and approval when we stage and when we present our lives in the exact way that we want to. And it enables us to do that very thing. But if Christ is to be the head of the church, as Paul says in Colossians chapter 1, the head of the church, we have to be able to discern when the culture is presenting a contrary opinion, enticing as it may be, as good as it may feel. Pursuit of self can't lead the way. It can't be how we do things. It can't be how we operate on social media. It can't be in our heart and in our mind when we engage and participate in social media. The prosperity theology of, the late 20th century that thrived for decades in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it's still around today, but really thrived in the late 20th century decades. It doesn't have the same influence that it once did, but people are no less influenced by the pursuit of personal prosperity. It just looks a little different now. And we see that on social media. One writer says, instead of the health and wealth message that we saw before, the new prosperity gospel centers on self-actualization, self-promotion, and self-worth, where the gospel of self-fulfillment is preached with passion. Being that we're all so obsessed with being digitally connected, as we are in today's day and age, we've conformed to that culture of self, and we often encounter on social media. And we do it maybe subconsciously. Maybe for some of us, we do it more consciously. Promote and perpetuate self. The pursuit of trendiness, the pursuit of personal success and narcissism, and the proliferation of our brand are all placed at the center of what it means to be successful. For some, they use it in their faith, in their Christianity, and they make a mockery of the actual way of Christ and what's presented in His Word. And in this sort of Christian iteration, the central principle of following Jesus and picking up your cross daily seems to have been lost. And dying to self is actually the antithesis of the culture today. It's not about dying to self, it's about having self survive and thrive and perpetuating it. But for us as believers, we need to be discerning of that as we engage and approach social media, because for us, everything is hinged on Christ, picking up our cross daily, dying to self. We're called to live through Him and for Him, not through self and for self. And John the Baptist succinctly puts things into perspective when he says to critics, He must become greater, Christ must become greater and greater, and I must become less and less. John chapter 3 and verse 30. The question that we should be asking ourselves as we move forward with social media, as we think about it, as we ponder how we're going to use it moving forward, if we should move it using forward, these kinds of things, is whose name is going to be made great? Does the Christianity we subscribe to give valor to self, or does it give valor to Christ? Does it acknowledge Him as the focal point in our lives, or does it place self in the center? Who becomes greater in our lives on social media, and who's lowered? Are we reflecting our own image or Christ's image on social media? Are we more interested in ourself becoming greater and greater, or Christ? A blogger on it, actually as an author, he wrote a book on it, says that social media is a hyper-capitalist venture where you are at the same time the consumer, the product, and the producer. And with this promise of likes and followers, we produce images of our mediated selves to the world, curating our own brand. And on social media, we become mediated personalities, and as a result, it subconsciously shapes us by celebritizing us. It's well put. The way in which social media has evolved into the me machine that it is today, or at least how it's used today, and I believe that's how it's used predominantly today. It's presented to us an issue of worship, ultimately. Obsessively posting, perfectly crafting our own photos and words, posting praise for ourselves, in general building a platform for our brand and personal elevation are all forms of self-idolatry. We're the center in which everything else orbits around, rather than God being the one that we orbit around. James chapter 3, verse 15 says that these types of things, this type of this type of behavior are earthly, unspiritual, and demonic. Selfish ambition, the selfish ambition that we see in building our brand via social media, James calls unspiritual, earthly, and demonic. We want to advance ourselves rather than God. And all of social media, as I said, is set up for this. You like my post. You heart my picture, rather. You comment on my post. You retweet me. The aspiring career path for young people today, what is it? To be like an influencer. To have so much clout, to be so popular, to have such a well-established brand that eventually you can monetize that. And companies will pay you for the brand of self that you have built. It's bloated humanity's capacity for self-absorption to extremes that I don't know if we've ever seen before through social media or because of social media. It's become nothing more than a carefully crafted highlight reel of our own personal awesomeness for us to flaunt around and to use to advance our own cause for whatever sort of selfish purpose we have. And as a culture, we've surpassed the simple, we look back on it and we laugh at it, but those were the simpler times where we've surpassed the simple duck-faced selfie phase, as James painfully demonstrated for us last month, and that I won't do up here this month. We've surpassed those days, and it's become a place where every life event, even events we're utterly disconnected from, have become a hashtagable opportunity for us to promote our own self, for us to put ourselves in the spotlight, even things that are disconnected from us personally. Self-promoting content, everything, every event that happens, we use as an opportunity to self-promote. You know what I can't stand? Happy birthday posts to people who are not even on social media. Who's that for? Not the people that you're saying happy birthday to. They're not going to see that. It's a weird thing. It's awkward is what it is. Like, that's for you. That's like a virtue signal or something. That's for your own self. You see hashtags like hashtag tags for likes, hashtag likes for likes, hashtag tags for tags, and so on. That's a real thing. I didn't know that until this week. You see social media activism, kind of along the same lines as the birthday thing. Temporary profile pic changes when something heinous happens in the world. Posts about crises and events. These type of things are converted into content for our social media and a promotional opportunity for the people using it. Because, turns out signaling virtue is actually pretty good for building your brand. It makes you look good when you signal virtue. But it's also unbiblical in terms of how we're called to live. In Matthew chapter 6, 1 through 4, we see a pretty good idea of how Christ might respond to these types of things. This type of signaling virtue for the purpose of promoting me, promoting my own brand, promoting how I'm perceived. He says, don't do your good deeds publicly, to be admired by others, for you'll lose the reward of your Father in heaven. And And when you give to someone in need, don't do as the hypocrites do, blowing trumpets in the synagogues and streets to call attention to their acts of charity. I tell you the truth, they received all the reward they will ever get. But when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, and give your gifts in private, and your Father who sees everything will reward you. We're not called to signal virtue, and we're certainly not called to do it to promote self. Some of you guys might think, I'm being a little overly cynical, especially with the birthday thing. That's fine. I don't. I think it's awkward, and I think there's something in your heart that's off there when you're trying to put yourself in the spotlight, and you're taking opportunities as simple as someone's birthday to do that. And I think, of course, there's plenty of benign social media interaction and engagement. A picture of your kid or something for memory's sake or for the sake of a family member far away, a status update about something inconsequential. I'm not saying everyone acts in this way on social media or that everyone uses social media in this way, but I think a large majority of people do. And I think that's what the culture enables and influences in social media. And so we're called to be discerning of that. Are we doing the same thing? Whether it's consciously thinking about it and doing it or subconsciously. Only you and God know where your heart lies with those things, but we should always be asking ourselves, why am I doing that? What am I hoping to achieve there in that post, in that picture? It's very much in opposition when it's for self. It's very much in opposition to how we're called to think and live once we accept Christ. And he himself spoke plainly to his disciples when he said in Matthew 16, verse 24 through 27, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, follow me. Whoever wants to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What good will it do a person if he gains the whole world but forfeits his soul? Or what will a person give in exchange for his soul? The Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels and will then repay every person according to his deeds. Self-denial and pursuit of and with Christ is foundational in our calling. But social media doesn't enable that. Social media doesn't encourage self-denial. It encourages selfish ambition and promoting our own brand over God's, which runs contrary to the very nature of who God is and who we're called to be. I find it, poetic and beautiful that Christ's entire ministry, from the simplest to the greatest of acts, was predicated on denying himself. The Creator God humbles himself and becomes a man, an act of self-denial. As a man, he lives and labors with and for the people around him in his ministries, an act of self-denial. He goes to the cross and dies for the sins of all mankind, past, present, and future, the act of self-denial. And yet, it's through all of this work and service to others, it's his brand, which we're talking about still today, thousands of years later. It's his brand, which we model our own lives after. It's Christ's brand that has infinite staying power because at its core, it wasn't for self, but for others. It's his brand that resonates with even non-believers because of its profound and infinite ability to reconnect us with the image of God that we're created in. It's not without reason that some of the most revered jobs and careers in a society are those that, intrinsic to their nature, deny self. You think about civil service jobs, firefighters, historically police officers, although that's being attacked today, teachers, soldiers, so on. People with a perspective to serve someone greater than themselves. Through social media, we see an inversion of what we're prioritizing and what we revere. The culture around us also tries to fill the void of approval that many people grow up having with a meaningless and seemingly endless pursuit of validation through self-promotion. I think it was last month I was talking in a cell group about how it was several years ago, but there was a very brief moment in time where Instagram did away with the like feature, like the heart, liking someone's photo, hearting someone's photo, because as people from Instagram recognized and said, it promoted a really unhealthy society of narcissism and seeking approval through unhealthy means and so on. We've obviously seen a reversion of that since then. It was very short-lived. As believers, we should strive to be like Paul and the early disciples who traveled from church to church with the same consistent message. What we do is for God, not for man. And we see this in several of his letters to the churches he visited, to the church in Thessalonica, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 4 through 6. We speak as messengers approved by God to be entrusted with the good news. Our purpose is to please God, not people. He alone examines the motives of our hearts, and never once did we try to win you with flattery, as you well know. And God is our witness that we're not pretending to be your friends just to get your money. As for human praise, we've never sought it from you or for anyone else. And he says to the church in Corinth, 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 18, when people commend themselves, it doesn't count for much. The important thing is for the Lord to commend them. And to the church in Galatia, chapter 1, verse 10, obviously, I'm not trying to win the approval of people, but of God. If pleasing people were my goal, I wouldn't be Christ's servant. That's pretty plain. Christ in his rebuke to the Pharisees says in John chapter 5, 41 through 44, your approval means nothing to me, because I know you don't have God's love within you. For I have come to you in my Father's name, and you have rejected me. Yet if others come in their own name, you gladly welcome them. No wonder you can't believe, for you gladly honor each other, but you don't care about the honor that comes from the one who alone is God. Social media breeds an obsessive society of self, where every time our phone dings, we make a mad rush to check our likes, our hearts, our comments. And like drug addicts, we crave the dopamine release that comes when we see our brand trending, and that we've gained the admiration and approval of others. We want our brand to win. When it comes to your guys' social media use, are you thinking about how you can make God greater and greater and yourself less and less? And I'm not talking about hitting people over the head with your faith, but I'm asking you to consider your motives on social media and analyze where your heart is in that. Are you thinking about how you can make God's brand greater and greater and your own less and less? Or are you really trying to be that trending person? Are you trying to gain admiration of others? Are you trying to promote self above all else? Are you falling into the cultural trap of perpetual and endless promotion of self? And are you spinning your wheels, highlighting your own accomplishments and signaling the virtues of the day, the week, the month? Where does your heart ultimately lie in the way that you view and use social media? How does it compare to what the culture encourages? My questions for you then are not those. Here they are, officially. Is your social media really just a self-media? A platform for you to be greater and greater? What purpose is it really serving? Secondly, whose brand are you advertising on social media? In your interactions, in your posts, in your pictures, in your comments, in your tweets, however you guys partake. Whose brand are you promoting? Third, in what other ways are you encouraged to promote self when it comes to these mediums? Maybe I missed a couple. What other ways do you see the encouragement to promote self through social media? What are you fishing for when you make a post to social media? Are you fishing for something? Are you fishing for the approval of others? Whose approval matters most to you? And then lastly, what can you do to better reflect and highlight Christ rather than yourself on social media? What can you do to better reflect and highlight Christ rather than yourself? It's hard because social media is set up to do you. What can you do to better promote Christ?